This video is sponsored by me. I recently just published my new novel, The Istanbul Affair, and it is now on sale for Amazon. Let me know if you are interested. 4 years ago, I kept close tabs on the 2016 election as it was really funny. When it came to this 2020 election, I pretty much didn't care. I didn't watch any of the debates or even look at polls. That's why I didn't immediately react when Biden won. The only part I did pay attention to was the rap battle here on YouTube, as it was quite funny. One thing that has been up for debate for decades is whether or not elections here in the West are rigged. This debate has gone on long before Trump had made his famous rant back in 2016. For this video, we're going to talk about the United States, as that's still the hotspot right now. The first reason why elections can't be rigged is because it doesn't have just one election, it has 50 elections. And it's not just that, in every state, counties and towns have their own elections with their own independent oversights. When you take that into account, all counties in the US is 50 states and territories. It accounts to thousands of elections, basically, for one president. It's a decentralized system which makes it too complex for fraud. Another argument is the old one, which is about tampered ballots. A good example of this is the 2004 election where George Bush won his second term by a narrow margin. The main focal point here was the state of Ohio. The overseer of elections in each state is the Secretary of State, and many suspected that the then Secretary of Ohio, Ken Blackwell, which was a Republican, hoped to swing the vote in favor of George Bush. The claim goes that he engineered long lines at polling stations, purged voters from their rolls, and failed to register 25% of new voters. There was also talk that about 150,000 votes from rural Ohio were switched from Kerry to Bush, either by hacking voting machines or by changing ballots.
And therefore, we cannot win this election.
There is a small but blood-curdling group of reports of voting irregularities and possible fraud, principally in Ohio and Florida. And that group of reports is moving from that end of the spectrum, in which believers are also likely to be wearing hats made out of Reynolds wrap, to the other end of the spectrum, in which the believers are going to the General Accounting Office and perhaps the FBI. Ohio has other problems tonight. The state reports 92,000 presidential votes did not count.
I was an election inspector for 10 years, and when the Florida debacle happened, I quit. I was so angry because the whole sanctity of the process was destroyed. To me, the election is a very central issue. It's not left, it's not right, it's central. And that we have to have a much higher standard for that process than we have for our political processes.
Well, why do you think so many people that I know in my neighborhood are good Democrats are telling me, forget about it, it's over, there's nothing we can do?
Because there's been a media blackout. Because nobody's talking about it.
People haven't seen a smoking gun. Activists networked together in solidarity. You see, we're just little guys. We're numerous, but we're little guys.
Yeah, why do you think? I think it'll start running into itself.
I think it's perfect. It looks great.
Good evening. An Associated Press poll tonight suggests that 54% of us Americans have been given renewed confidence about the nation's electoral system based on last week's decisive presidential election. You guys might want to put that poll back into the field again next week. The mainstream newspaper, the Cincinnati Enquirer, reports that officials in Warren County, Ohio, that's 20 miles northeast of Cincinnati, locked down their administration building last Tuesday night to prevent anybody from observing the vote count. Moreover, the secrecy, unique among all 88 of Ohio's counties, was attributed to concerns about potential terrorism. Warren County's polls were among the last in Ohio to close, thus among the last to report, and thus among the votes that clinched the state and the election for President Bush. And the Ohio numbers are straightforward compared to Florida. Baker County, Florida, on the Georgia border, for instance, 69% of voters registered Democrats, 24% Republicans. Yet President Bush got 7,738 votes and Senator Kerry just 2,180. In Holmes County, in the Panhandle, 7 Democrats for every 2 Republicans in the district. Bush beat Kerry 6,410 to 1,810. In Dixie County, 77.5% registered Democrats, Bush 4,433, Kerry 1959. Lafayette County, 83% Democratic, Bush 2,460, Kerry 845. In Liberty County, Bristol, Florida, 88% of registered voters there are Democrat, 8% Republican. Bush, 1,927, Kerry, 1,070. In Florida counties where optical scanning of paper ballots was not used, no such violent swings were reported. Counties with heavy Democratic registration voted Democratic. Counties with heavy Republican registration voted Republican.
The other thing is, Mandeep was talking about educating ourselves. So I want you guys to help me out. We'll just think about some websites.
For the 6 weeks since the election, somewhere around 20% of the nation's citizens have continued to doubt the election, and much of the other 80% have dismissed those doubts, largely by saying, well, how come the Democrats aren't screaming about it? Or if there's a problem, where's the FBI? Or how come I haven't read about this in the New York Times? Our third story in the countdown today, the New York Times reported that the senior Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee was asking the FBI to investigate what he called inappropriate and likely illegal election tampering in Ohio. That affidavit by Cheryl Eaton, a Democrat, contends that last Friday, in advance of the recount in Ohio, an employee of the company that made the vote counting software used in their county returned there, and according to Conyers' letter to the FBI, he modified the computer tabulator, learned which precinct was planned to be the subject of the initial test recount, and made further alterations based on that information, and advised the election officials how to manipulate the machinery so that the preliminary hand recount matched the machine count. Congressman Conyers had told...
However, all of these were proven false. Even half of the new voters who did have to fill out additional documentation in order to be registered, quite unfairly though, they still voted for Bush. The voter rolls were purged as they were required to by law because people either die or move. It was also found that none of the 150,000 ballots were changed. Even the Democratic Party concluded with their own investigation in their own words. Despite the problems on Election Day, there is no evidence from our survey that John Kerry won the state of Ohio. Another argument talks about voter suppression. These cases have happened in the US, but it was not systematic or widespread. Due to observers on both Republican and Democratic sides, people rarely vote when they're not allowed to. Cases where people impersonated others or voted multiple times is an act that voters themselves try to do to influence the election. In the US, only about 31 cases of voter impersonation have been documented over the last 14 years. It's easier to do so with people who have their votes mailed to them, but the amount of mailed ballots is very small. There was also a study that claimed about how 6% of non-citizens living in the US voted, but that study has long since been debunked. So when it comes to these kinds of things nowadays, I'm getting this kind of feeling. In the past, it was not a question of which president won, or were you a conservative or a liberal in basically any part of the Western world. It was just, were you a citizenship of that nation, and whoever was elected became the president, and that was pretty much it. But then now when I look at all this stuff, it shows how polarized how our society has become, and how our modern leaders, both on the left and the right, are basically willing to just reinforce the stereotype that if they lose, then the election must be rigged. It's basically their attempt at trying to contain power, even though they have basically lost the election. Now, a couple of years back, when I was first being posted to Europe, I originally wanted to live in the United Kingdom, and that's why I was a strong proponent of the Remain campaign during its Brexit referendum. And then, after the Remain campaign sadly lost, then the Brexiteers basically told the Remainers to just suck it up. Well, I think we've said this multiple times already, but we have a clear example right now. I think that the Trump supporters who basically saw their candidate lose basically need to suck it up themselves, just like the Remainers had to do during the Brexit referendum.
Past 40 years, we've concentrated on making sure that the franchise was not impeded by onerous regulations and unfair processes. In the last 6 years, we've looked at the other voting right, and that is the right to make sure that legal ballots are not negated by fraudulent ballots. And as a consequence, I think there's a good balance that we've been able to strike between those two voting rights.
And how much of a problem are fraudulent voting?
Well, let me put it to you this way. we have enough evidence that there are folks who either screw up the process deliberately or accidentally. Judicial Watch has done an exhaustive review of 2008. For instance, they found that 1.3 million registrations were collected by Acorn and Project Vote, and of that, over 400,000 were banned.